Congresswoman Gwen Moore joining us now. I want to know, are you attending the inauguration, and how concerned are you about security considering everything you've already been through?
Well, thanks for asking. I haven't missed any inaugural since I've been an elected member of Congress. I attended Donald Trump's inaugural. I attended both of Barack Obama's inaugurals, and I know that security is an issue. And as we've talked about already, I am recovering from COVID-19. I have members of my family who are recovering, and truly, like the old adage, I need to spend more time with my family, starting with being concerned about my own health. And I just am so grateful to everyone who's reached out to me during this time, so I am going to avail myself of the virtual inaugural. There's not very much. There won't be very much to do. I think that I can't really enjoy it by watching it virtually. As you know, Wisconsin, and I was a co-host of the virtual DNC convention. I thought we did an excellent job. And I think that we're going to be surprised at how well done this inaugural will be virtually. And it's not just because of the risks from the insurrectionists, but it's also the health risks. That we shouldn't convene in large crowds.
How concerned are you for the safety then for the people you know attending, considering all these warnings from the FBI, whether it be the inauguration or other really capitals across the country?
I take these threats very seriously. I think one of the criticisms that really can't be avoided is that there was all kind of open sourced information about the groups that were forming. The president himself summoned them to come to Washington, D.C. on January 6th. And so I think that the woeful preparation is something that's going to be examined. We're also going to look at why the president and his administration wouldn't deploy National Guard to the Capitol once the mayor of DC implored and begged them for help. What was the big delay in deploying those troops, and the extent to which there was inside help and cooperation, unfortunately, from people, perhaps even inside of the Capitol itself. There's a lot of healing to do, as Republicans like to point out, but it won't come without the truth and reconciliation first.
And you voted to impeach the president. You gave a very passionate speech about this. Do you think we'll see the Senate eventually go to trial, and when?
I can tell you, Adrienne, I would have hoped the first time I voted to impeach Donald Trump that the Senate would have removed him. But I was not allowing my vote and my agency and my voice to be guided by whether or not they would actually remove him. I think the Republican Party has an opportunity to purge someone from their party who has shown time and again that he is unfit for public office. And it's difficult for me to believe, and I've had conversations with Republicans, and I've served with Republicans over the years. I know what real Republicans are like, for God's sake. And this is an opportunity, I think, for them. He has committed impeachable offenses. These are things that I'm quoting from Republican colleagues of mine, Liz Cheney. Even Mitch McConnell believes that impeachable offenses have occurred. The president has refused to acknowledge that there were lies which led to these insurgents. As a matter of fact, the QAnon shaman, I think they call him, his attorney has already asserted his defense that he didn't do anything wrong. He was just coming to Washington, D.C. At the invitation of the president and was doing what he thought the president wanted him to do. So, he really can't distance himself from creating and inciting this terrorism. And I think that he's dangerous. every moment that he is in office offers yet another opportunity for him to commit more high crimes and misdemeanors. And in fact, this shaman has reached out to him already for a pardon. One of the things that I dread, that these murderers, and it's not as if the president hasn't already pardoned murderers, that they would get a pardon. So there are so many things that could go wrong. And as you recall in my speech, I do think that a president who's not actually removed from office could avail himself of the privilege of an ex-president and have intelligence briefings, monetize those briefings. I think he's dangerous and needs to be removed. That would be my recommendation for the Senate.
And the Senate trial, it wouldn't be until after Joe Biden is already president. So why would you want them to go through with it? I think that's one of the questions from Republicans.
Exactly. That is exactly the reason, because after they remove him, they could then vote to curtail the sort of powers and authorities he'll have as an ex-president. One of the things would be, with a simple majority vote, to prevent him from getting these intelligence briefings. I think it would be very dangerous for a Donald Trump, twice impeached, to have that privilege were he not removed. And, you know, I think it's so disingenuous to talk about healing after this insurrection, which hasn't happened since the War of 1812, where the Capitol was overtaken, where the next people in line for the presidency, the vice president and the speaker, were cowering and running from a lynch mob. And people 100 feet away from the vice president, and for them to say, "Oh well, let's just forget everything and just move on."
Because that's one of the things that Republicans are saying, is that impeachment doesn't bring the country together, is what you're referring to.
Well, when you break it, you own it, Adrienne. And I'm just wondering how realistic that is in terms of a framework for how human beings really behave. Your husband cheats on you, buys $5,000 worth of jewelry for some other woman and says, "Oh, honey, let's just forget it and move on." And it just doesn't work that way. There is accountability. 5 people are dead. There are 50 officers Capitol Police, that went to the hospital. There's another officer that's probably going to lose his eye. There are people who are traumatized from their experience in the Capitol. And I sympathize with the notion that we ought to just be able to move on. But there is no moving on, and there's no reconciling without reconciling.
Well,
and we have got to reconcile the lie that this was an unfair election. That's a lie. And we have got to reconcile the fact that there were racial white supremacist dimensions to this. There's a reconciliation that will come with the truth.
And I do want to ask you one more question, because obviously Democrats will have total majority here. So after everything that's happened, do you want to work with fellow Republicans? How do you go forward?
Well, I've belonged to some kind of legislative body for a long time, Adrienne. You have to work together. The best products come out of bipartisanship. So, of course, we're going to have bipartisanship. There's going to be a very narrow majority. But for the vice president of the United States, there would be no majority in the United States Senate. We have a narrow margin in the House of Representatives. People have different ideas. Of course, we're going to work together. But this notion that Democrats are totally responsible for the healing after 4 years of, carnage, as the president promised us that there would be carnage. And at the end of it, we see dead bodies. And to say that the burden of healing falls on Democrats to just pretend nothing happened. I don't think that's a realistic framework. I think healing, cooperation, working together are going to be necessary. But I think denial is at the roots of everything that has happened. The president, people like Senator Johnson, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz denying that President Biden had won the election is at the root of this violence. We can't continue to be in denial and expect to heal.
Well, Congresswoman Moore, nice to see you. Thank you.
And thank you for having me.